February 27th, 1943. A moonless night in the mountains of Norway. 6 men on skis glide silently through snow-covered valleys, moving toward a fortress carved into the side of a cliff. Inside that fortress, Nazi scientists are creating something that could change the outcome of World War II. Something that could give Adolf Hitler the power to level entire cities with a single weapon. These 6 men carry explosives. They have one mission: destroy the facility, stop Hitler's atomic bomb, and escape alive. This is not Hollywood fiction. This is history. This is the story of Operation Gunnerside, the most daring sabotage mission of the Second World War. The mission that may have saved the world from nuclear annihilation. In 1939, German scientists made a discovery that would terrify the world. They successfully split the uranium atom. Nuclear fission, the release of enormous energy from the heart of matter itself. Theoretical physicists immediately understood the implications. This discovery could lead to a weapon of unimaginable destructive power. An atomic bomb. Adolf Hitler's Germany had some of the world's finest physicists: Werner Heisenberg, Otto Hahn, Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker. These brilliant minds began working on the Nazi nuclear program, codenamed the Unwavering, the Uranium Club. Their goal was simple and terrifying: build an atomic bomb before anyone else. But there was a problem, a significant obstacle in the path to nuclear weapons. The Germans needed a specific substance, a rare material that would allow them to sustain a nuclear chain reaction. They needed heavy water. Heavy water, deuterium oxide, chemically similar to ordinary water, but with hydrogen atoms that contain an extra neutron. This substance could moderate neutrons in a nuclear reactor, slowing them down just enough to maintain a controlled fission reaction. Without heavy water, the Nazi atomic program would stall, and in 1940, there was only one place in the world producing heavy water in industrial quantities: a hydroelectric plant clinging to the side of a mountain gorge in Telemark, Norway. The Vemork plant. Vemork was an engineering marvel. Built in 1911, it stood on the edge of the Rjukan waterfall, 600 feet above the Manana River. The plant used electrolysis, powered by the massive waterfall, to produce hydrogen. As a byproduct of this process, it created heavy water. Before the war, Vemork supplied heavy water to laboratories across Europe for scientific research. But when Nazi Germany invaded Norway on April 9, 1940, everything changed. German forces swept through the country in a lightning campaign. The Norwegian military, unprepared and outnumbered, fought bravely but was overwhelmed. By June, Norway was under Nazi occupation. The Vemork plant fell into German hands. The Nazis immediately understood what they possessed. They ordered Vemork to increase heavy water production dramatically, from a few kilograms per month to thousands. German scientists and engineers arrived to oversee operations. The heavy water was shipped to laboratories in Germany, where Heisenberg's team was attempting to build an experimental nuclear reactor. Allied intelligence caught wind of these activities. British and American physicists, many of them refugees from Nazi-occupied Europe, were racing to develop their own atomic bomb. They knew what German control of heavy water meant. If the Nazis succeeded in building a functioning nuclear reactor, they would be one step closer to an atomic weapon. The stakes could not be higher. The British government decided to act. The plant had to be destroyed. But Vemork was not an easy target. It sat on a cliff face, accessible only by a narrow suspension bridge, heavily guarded by German soldiers. The gorge below was considered impassable. The facility itself was built like a fortress. Bombing it from the air would be difficult and might not destroy the critical heavy water production cells deep inside the plant. The mission would require something different, something precise, sabotage from within. And that meant sending men on the ground. Life in occupied Norway was a study in oppression and quiet resistance. The German military presence was everywhere. Wehrmacht soldiers patrolled the streets of Oslo. The Gestapo hunted down resistance members. Collaborators reported suspicious activity to the authorities. Norwegians who resisted faced imprisonment, torture, or execution, but the Norwegian spirit did not break. From the beginning of the occupation, resistance networks formed. Teachers refused to teach Nazi propaganda. Workers engaged in slowdowns at factories producing goods for Germany. Underground newspapers circulated, spreading news and maintaining morale. And slowly a more active resistance emerged. Young Norwegian men and women began forming organized groups. They gathered intelligence on German military positions, sabotaged railway lines and equipment, helped Allied agents and downed airmen escape to Sweden. The resistance was careful, methodical, and brave. They knew the risks. Discovery meant death. The British Special Operations Executive, known as SO, recognized the potential of the Norwegian resistance. Created in 1940, under Prime Minister Winston Churchill's directive to set Europe ablaze, SO trained agents in sabotage, espionage, and guerrilla warfare. Norwegian volunteers who had escaped to Britain were recruited and trained. These men learned to parachute, use explosives, transmit coded radio messages, survive in harsh wilderness conditions, and kill silently. They were being prepared for missions behind enemy lines. Missions like destroying the Vemork plant. In October 1942, SO launched the first phase of the operation. Code name, Grouse. 4 Norwegian agents were parachuted into the Hardangervidda, the vast mountain plateau near the Vemork plant. Their mission was reconnaissance, scout the area, establish contact with local resistance members, gather intelligence on German defenses, and prepare for the arrival of a sabotage team. The 4 men of Operation Grouse were Jens Anton Poulsen, Knut Haugland, Claus Helberg, and Arne Kjelstrup. All were experienced outdoorsmen, intimately familiar with the Norwegian wilderness. They would need every bit of that experience. The team parachuted in on the night of October 18, 1942. They landed on the Hardangervidda Plateau, one of the most desolate places in Europe. A frozen, wind-swept wilderness where temperatures could drop to 40 degrees below zero, where blizzards could appear without warning and last for days. The Grouse team established a base in an abandoned mountain cabin. They lived on sparse rations, occasionally supplementing their supplies by hunting reindeer. They waited for the signal that the sabotage team was coming. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. The Norwegian winter closed in around them. Then came news that changed everything. The British were sending a different team first. Not trained Norwegian commandos, but British Royal Engineers. 34 men would come in by glider, land near Vemork, and blow up the plant. The grouse team was ordered to prepare a landing zone and guide the Kai's team was ordered to prepare a landing zone and guide the British force to the target. On November 19, 1942, 2 Halifax bombers took off from Scotland, each towing a glider full of British soldiers. Operation Freshman had begun. It was a disaster. One bomber crashed into a mountain in bad weather, killing everyone aboard. The glider it was towing came down miles away. The survivors were captured by the Gestapo. Under Hitler's commando order, they were tortured and executed. The second bomber lost its glider over the mountains. That glider crashed as well. More deaths. More captures, more executions. Operation Freshman was a complete failure. 34 British soldiers dead. Nothing accomplished except to alert the Germans that someone was trying to destroy Vemork. Security at the plant increased immediately. More guards, more patrols. The mission had just become exponentially more difficult. But so did not give up. A new operation was planned. This time it would be Norwegians, men who knew the terrain, who could ski like they were born with planks on their feet, who could survive in conditions that would kill most soldiers. The mission was codenamed Gunnerside. 6 Norwegian commandos would parachute into the Hardangervidda, link up with the grouse team, and attack the Vemork plant. They would have to cross miles of frozen wilderness in the middle of winter, infiltrate one of the most heavily guarded facilities in occupied Norway, plant explosive with precision, and escape across hundreds of miles of enemy territory. The 6 men of Operation Gunnerside were carefully selected. Each was a volunteer. Each understood that this was likely a one-way mission. Joachim Ronberg, 23 years old, the leader, calm, methodical, a natural commander. He had escaped Norway in 1941 and trained with SOE in Scotland. He was an expert in explosives and small unit tactics. Knut Håkelid, 29 years old. Strong, resilient, with an intimate knowledge of the Telemark region. He had also escaped to Britain and undergone SO training. His local knowledge would prove invaluable. Frederick Kaiser, 24 years old. A skilled radio operator and mountaineer. Quiet but dependable. Casper Eidland, 26 years old. Tough and resourceful, experienced in winter survival. Hans Storhog, 24 years old, an engineer who understood the technical aspects of the Vemork plant. Birger Stromsheim, 25 years old, determined and physically powerful. These men trained together in the Scottish Highlands through the fall and winter of 1942. They practiced skiing in blizzard conditions, rehearsed the assault on a mock-up of the Vemork facility, memorized every detail of the plant's layout. They trained until their movements were automatic, until they could assemble and place explosives blindfolded. On the night of February 16, 1943, the 6 men boarded a bomber at an airfield in Scotland. The aircraft climbed into the darkness and turned east toward occupied Norway, toward the mountains, toward their target. The flight was long and turbulent. The bomber navigated by dead reckoning, trying to find the drop zone in complete darkness over snow-covered terrain. Finally, the pilot spotted the signal fires lit by the grouse team. The green light came on. One by one, the 6 men jumped into the howling night. They landed scattered across the plateau. It took hours to gather the team and recover their equipment containers. Some of their supplies were lost, buried in deep snow. But they were down. They were in Norway. The mission was on. For the next 11 days, the Gunnerside team skied across the Hardanger Vidda toward the rendezvous point with the grouse team. The conditions were brutal. Temperatures plunged far below zero. Winds howled across the open plateau. Visibility dropped to nothing during whiteout conditions. They navigated by compass and by instinct, moving during the day when they could see, sheltering in snowdrifts at night. They pulled pulks, sleds loaded with equipment, across the frozen wasteland. Their rations were minimal. They were constantly cold, constantly exhausted. On February 23rd, the Gunnerside team reached a remote cabin where the grouse team was waiting. The reunion was emotional. The grouse men had been living in the wilderness for 4 months, surviving on hope and stubbornness. Now, finally, reinforcements had arrived. 10 men now. 10 Norwegian soldiers in one of the most inhospitable places on earth. They had 5 days to plan the attack. 5 days to rest, eat, and prepare for what came next. Ronberg gathered intelligence from the grouse team. They had been observing the Vemork plant for months. They knew the guard rotations, the layout of the facility, the location of the heavy water electrolysis cells in the basement. They had even made contact with sympathetic Norwegian workers inside the plant who provided detailed information. The plan came together. The team would approach on skis under cover of darkness. They would descend into the Manana Gorge, which the Germans considered impassable and therefore left unguarded. They would climb the opposite cliff face to reach the plant, enter through a cable tunnel, place explosives on the heavy water cells, set timers, and escape the way they came. Simple in concept, nearly impossible in execution, but it was their only chance. Ronberg split the team into 2 groups. A covering party would remain outside, ready to provide suppressing fire if the alarm was raised. An assault party would enter the plant and place the explosives. Speed and silence were everything. If shooting started, German reinforcements would arrive quickly, and the mission would fail. On the evening of February 27th, the team began their final approach. They skied down from the plateau toward the valley where the Vemork plant stood. The night was dark, but clear. The temperature was 20 degrees below zero. They reached the edge of the gorge and looked down. 600 feet of nearly vertical cliff face. Snow-covered rock. Ice. Below, the Manana River roared through the darkness. The Germans had not bothered to guard this approach because they believed it was impossible. The Norwegians proved them wrong. Using ropes and sheer determination, the assault team descended into the gorge. They crossed the frozen river and began climbing the opposite side, hand over hand, finding grips in the rock, pulling themselves upward through snow and ice. It took over an hour of painful, silent climbing. But they made it. They reached the top, near the plant's perimeter fence. No alarm, no guards. They cut through the fence with wire cutters and moved toward the building. The plant loomed above them, a massive concrete structure built into the mountainside. Lights glowed in some windows. They could hear the hum of machinery. Somewhere inside, German guards were on duty, but most of the facility was quiet. It was late. Most workers had gone home. Ronberg led the assault team to the cable tunnel entrance they had identified in planning. It was a narrow opening, barely large enough for a man to crawl through. They squeezed inside, one by one, moving through darkness. The tunnel led to the basement of the facility. They emerged into a corridor lit by a single dim bulb. They could hear voices in the distance, German voices, but the heavy water electrolysis room was close. Ronberg checked his watch. They were on schedule. They reached a steel door, locked. They tried to force it, but it would not budge. Precious seconds ticked away. Then Hakalid found another entrance. A window high up on the wall, too small for a man in full gear, but just barely large enough if they removed their equipment first. Ronberg and Kaiser climbed through the window and dropped into the electrolysis room. Rows of heavy water production cells stood before them, humming with electric current. This was the target. This was what they had come hundreds of miles to destroy. They worked quickly, methodically. They placed explosive charges on each of the 18 cells, carefully connected the detonators, set the fuses for 30 seconds, enough time to escape, but not enough for anyone to disarm the charges. A door opened. A Norwegian night watchman entered the room. He froze, staring at the two armed men placing explosives. Ronberg raised a finger to his lips. The watchman nodded. He understood. He said nothing and backed out of the room. The charges were set. Ronberg lit the fuses. The team scrambled back through the window, grabbed their gear, and ran. Back through the corridor, back into the cable tunnel, out into the night. They were halfway down the cliff face when the explosions came. A series of dull thumps echoed through the gorge. Inside the plant, the heavy water cells shattered. Hundreds of gallons of heavy water poured onto the floor and drained away into the sewers. Germany's supply of heavy water, carefully accumulated over months, was gone in an instant. Alarms blared. Lights came on across the facility. German soldiers rushed from barracks, confused and disoriented. Where had the explosion come from? Where were the saboteurs? Shots were fired into the darkness, but they hit nothing. The Norwegians were already disappearing into the night. The 10 men regrouped at the bottom of the gorge and began skiing away from Vemork. They moved fast, knowing that German search parties would be mobilized within minutes. They had to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the plant before dawn. They skied through the night, hour after hour, pushing their exhausted bodies across the frozen landscape. Behind them, the Germans organized a pursuit. Hundreds of soldiers, search dogs, aircraft, the largest manhunt Norway had seen during the occupation. But the Norwegians had several advantages. They knew the terrain intimately. They could move on skis faster than German soldiers on foot, and they split up, each taking different escape routes, making it impossible for the Germans to track them all. 5 of the men skied nearly 300 miles to neutral Sweden, crossing the border after days of grueling travel. They were exhausted, frostbitten, but alive. They had made it. The other 5 remained in Norway, melting back into the resistance networks. They would continue fighting, continue sabotaging German operations. One of them, Knut Hakelid, would later carry out another mission against Vemork, sinking a ferry carrying the last remaining heavy water to Germany. But that is another story. The mission was a complete success. Not a single shot had been fired. Not a single Norwegian or German casualty. The plant's heavy water production capacity was destroyed. It would take months to rebuild. The German reaction was swift and brutal. The Gestapo arrested dozens of suspected resistance members. Innocent Norwegians were interrogated, tortured. The Germans imposed curfews and increased patrols across the region, but they never found the saboteurs. Hitler was furious. He ordered Vemork to be rebuilt immediately, but Allied intelligence was watching. As soon as repairs were completed, the facility was bombed by American B-17 flying fortresses in November 1943. The bombing caused additional damage but also killed Norwegian civilians working at the plant. The Germans finally gave up on Vemork. They dismantled what remained of the heavy water production and attempted to ship the existing supply to Germany. That shipment never arrived. Knut Hakelid and Norwegian resistance fighters sabotaged the ferry carrying the heavy water barrels. The ferry sank in the deepest part of Lake Ten. The heavy water went down with it. Germany's atomic program never recovered. Without heavy water, Heisenberg's team could not build a functioning nuclear reactor. They could not produce the plutonium needed for a bomb. The Nazi atomic program stalled, sputtered, and ultimately failed. Historians have debated how close Germany actually came to building an atomic bomb. Some argue that the Nazi program was never truly viable, hampered by Hitler's interference, lack of resources, and the emigration of Jewish physicists. Others believe that Germany was closer than we know, and that the destruction of heavy water production at Vemork was a decisive blow. What is certain is this: the mission succeeded. 6 men on skis, supported by 4 others who had survived months in the wilderness, struck a blow against Nazi Germany's most dangerous scientific program. They did it without firing a shot, without losing a single man, against impossible odds. After the war, the saboteurs returned to Norway. They were celebrated as heroes, though many were reluctant to accept the acclaim. They had done what needed to be done. Nothing more. Joachim Braunberg lived a long life, passing away in 2018 at the age of 99. He rarely spoke about the mission, but when he did, he emphasized the teamwork, the planning, the courage of the grouse team, who waited through the winter. He deflected praise, insisting that they were simply soldiers doing their duty. Knut Hakelid wrote a book about his experiences in the Norwegian resistance. He continued to work for Norwegian intelligence after the war. He never forgot the men who fought beside him. The others returned to civilian life. Kaiser became an engineer. Idland worked in business. Storhog and Stremsheim rebuilt their lives in a free Norway. They carried the memories of that frozen February night for the rest of their lives. Today, historians regard Operation Gunnerside as one of the most successful sabotage missions in military history. The British so called it the greatest act of sabotage in the war. General Dwight Eisenhower said it was worth the efforts of an entire division. The Vemork plant still stands in Telemark, now a museum. Visitors can walk through the rooms where the saboteurs placed their explosives. They can see the basement where history changed direction. They can look out over the gorge that the Germans thought was impassable, and they can remember 6 men on skis who changed the world. This mission was more than a tactical success. It was a statement, a declaration that tyranny, no matter how powerful, no matter how ruthless, could be resisted. That ordinary men, driven by courage and conviction, could strike back against seemingly invincible evil in the frozen mountains of Norway. 6 saboteurs proved that heroism does not require armies, that sometimes the most important battles are fought by the smallest units, that individuals acting with precision and courage can alter the course of history. They were not superhuman. They were cold. They were scared. They knew the odds. But they went anyway. They skied through blizzards. They climbed cliffs in darkness. They placed explosives in the heart of an enemy fortress and walked away into the night. And because they did, the world was spared the horror of Nazi atomic weapons. Because 6 men on skis refused to let Hitler win. Because in humanity's darkest hour, courage proved stronger than fear. This is the legacy of Operation Gunnerside. This is why we remember, not just the mission, but the men. Not just what they destroyed, but what they saved. The future they preserved. The world they protected. 6 men. 1 night. A mission that seemed impossible. And a victory that echoed through history. This is their story. This is why we must never forget